black eye, giving off the sense of someone who's just fallen into a bad whiskey. The church preached pacifism, peace to all men and women. It embraced religious tolerance, saying all Christian denominations and all people belonging to other religions deserve respect. Back in the day, it had been dead set against men fighting in the American Civil War. Even though the sect was anti-slavery, a stance that wasn't always popular in the American South. After that moment in the kitchen, Alvin put down the bottle for good and opened his heart to pacifism. He said, "Enough is enough. Peace to all men is the way forward." And for a while, this worked out for him. He became a much happier man. He'd been converted, and life was sweet. Things might have stayed that way had World War I not broken out in Europe. This wasn't exactly a perfect time to be a pacifist. Men from cities and towns all over America packed up their bags and headed to the front lines, where the trenches became their homes and rats became their housemates. But Alvin had taken his vow of nonviolence. He couldn't fight. He later said, "I was worried clean through. I didn't want to go and kill. I believed in my Bible." It didn't matter. All men in the U.S. at that time, aged 21 to 31, had to at least register for the draft. Still, Alvin made it clear what he believed in when he filled out the form. "Do you claim exemption from the draft?" was one of the questions, to which Alvin wrote, "Yes, don't want to fight." He then had a word with his pastor, and the pastor told him to say he was a conscientious objector. During the time of conscription, these people could say that they wouldn't fight, not because they were scared, but because the war didn't gel with their religious or even their moral values.
We asked 100 people, name the most annoying sound.
Kingsmill, fueling family fun.
It was never popular to say you objected to war on the grounds of your conscience, and it wasn't always accepted. If that was the case and you still refused to fight, you could go to prison. And Alvin was denied his right to not fight. He appealed, but it came to nothing. On October 12, 1917, he wrote in his diary, "So I was called to report to the local court."
I'll be a minute.
I haven't played Sonic Ribs. Oh. I'm playing that, right? Yep. What's the time? I'll play Sonic Ribs today.
Now, what's the time? 5:35. Suppose I have the time. I don't know whether I should do it today or tomorrow. I don't want to let my subscribers down. I don't want to let you guys down.
I went, and when they looked at me, they weighed me, and I weighed 170 pounds and was 72 inches tall. So they said I passed all right. Well, when they said that, I almost knew that I would have to go to the army. He was going to fight, whether or not. At least he had God. He really believed that big guy in the sky would protect him. On November 14th, he wrote another entry in his diary. "I knew that if it was right, everything would be all right. And I also knew that if it was wrong and I were only fighting for a bunch of foreigners, it would all be wrong." And I prayed and prayed. I prayed 2 whole days and a night out on the mountainside. And I received my assurance that it was all right, that I should go, and that I would come back without a scratch. He was assigned to Company G, 328th Infantry Regiment, 82nd Infantry Division. It soon became apparent to his officers that Alvin had some winning skills. His skill at hunting when he was a kid had turned him into what the officers called a crack shot. He could hit almost anything. In front of him was a sharpshooter in the making. Alvin often conversed with the officers about him being a pacifist. Captain Edward C.B. Danforth and the battalion commander Major G. Edward Buxton could understand. They were both religious men too, but they told Alvin that sometimes you had to fight for the greater good. They said violent actions needn't be done through anger or hate, and could just be something that needs to happen in order to make the world a better place. Soon after, Alvin found himself under the gray clouds of Britain, a different world altogether from his native Tennessee. And by God, were those Brits hard to understand. Sometimes he just nodded his head when he had no idea what people were saying. As for the Scots, his very own ancestors, they might have well been speaking Arabic. Accents from Liverpool, where he spent some time, weren't much easier to understand. Next, he was sent to France, where he did more training on the Western Front. It was
Scottish and hard to understand for the British.
In March 1918, he wrote in his
The
diary,
Americans,
shooting at squirrels
pretty
was
sure.
good, but busting a turkey at 150 yards, ho ho. So the army shooting was tolerably easy for me. His time was coming. Alvin was about to see some action as he was headed for the trenches. On May 21st, he talked about the men
I'm gonna have a
fighting
massive
alongside,
poop later.
writing, "It sure was
Minute
a
is
mixed platoon.
way too fast.
The Greeks and the
It's so good
Italians and
though.
New York
I haven't had a
Jews,
fucking
and there were
roast
some Irish and one German.
or
I sure did miss the mountain
roast
boys
beef
from
in a
Tennessee and
long
Kentucky,
time.
but I got to like these other boys in my platoon. I was the
Can I
largest
zoom
in the
out?
platoon. When the bullets started flying, he said
No.
his platoon was nervous.
I could zoom
Just
in
about
though.
all of them had never seen action. Some of them still looked like children. They did more dodging than shooting, with Alvin saying, "When those pesky bullets came humming and buzzing around our ears, just like a lot of mad hornets and bumblebees when you rob their nests in Tennessee, we used to do a powerful lot of ducking." During the nights, he'd sit alone with his thoughts, asking God what he should do. He didn't really want to kill any Germans. He didn't like the sight of dead men. He had the pride of their lives in their pockets. And man, was he starting to hate trenches. In September, things really started to get hair-raising. The artillery attacks barely ever stopped. The battalion was told to try to push forward, but they lost some men each time they
I bit my
attempted.
finger.
Alvin was now getting used to talking to a friend 1 minute and the next saying a prayer for him. His feet had been wet for weeks. He was beginning to worry about the dreaded trench foot. He still wholeheartedly believed God was watching over him. Again and again, as the bullets rang out, he remembered the passage in the Bible, Deuteronomy 21. "When thou goest out to battle against thine enemies, and seest horses and chariots, and the people more than thou, be not afraid of them, for the Lord thy God is with thee." He got lucky too, which only consolidated his belief that God was at his side. He wrote this in his diary: "While we were dug in on the hillside beyond Norroy, we saw a little vineyard. We were very hungry, and I'm telling you, those grapes just naturally made our mouths water. So we began to slip back after the grapes. But the Germans had an observation boat
Different.
up in the air. They saw us in the vineyard and directed the German artillery to touch us off. They escaped with their grapes, but it was a close shave. Soon Alvin was told his battalion would be joining the Meuse-Argonne offensive. This was a huge push on the Western Front. In fact, it's still the largest offensive in American history, with the U.S. employing 1.2 million American soldiers to move on the Germans. About 350,000 U.S. troops were injured, with around 26,000 of them dying. A similar number of Germans died, and God only knows how many French were killed. It was carnage in a war where carnage was a mainstay, when at times pushing forward seemed more like hopelessly running into bullets. Every yard of ground was fought over. Men's blood seeped into the soil. To make things worse, many of the U.S. soldiers were green and didn't have much battle training, not to mention the setback of so many guys coming down with the Spanish flu. There were 3 phases to the offensive involving close to 2 million men from all sides. So it didn't seem like a big deal when Alvin and his battalion were told they'd be taking Hill 223 from the Germans. If they were successful, they'd sever the Ducaville Railroad close to the commune of Châtel-Chehery. It would be just one small fight among many, but they had to do it. The Germans relied on that railway for resupply. Alvin went to sleep that night thinking about his mother, brothers, and sisters. He'd been told the battalion would come under heavy fire from German machine guns. He knew his life was at risk. He accepted it. God would make sure things turned out all right. At 6:10 a.m., they began to push forward. The Germans opened fire as Alvin and a group of 18 men headed by Sergeant Bernard Early tried to sneak behind German lines to take out the machine gun nests. This proved to be a success. Soon they had the German machine gunners looking at the ends of their guns. Some of them ran like rabbits when one guy stood up and shouted, "Kamerad, we surrender." 15 to 20 German soldiers stood up. There was no point in shooting them. They were done. But just as the feeling of relief came over Alvin, bullets started flying from all directions. He had no idea where they were coming from. He got down in the grass, watching as it was mowed down by a hail of bullets. Who was firing? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of his men were hit and killed almost instantly. Others were now lying on the ground screaming. It was chaos.
Help me!
Sergeant Early was hit, and Alvin pulled him to safety. Early told him he must take those nests at any cost. More men started falling as Alvin tried his best to move them to safety. Only he could get them out of this. He later wrote, "That left me in command. I was right out there in the open. If he failed, all of his battalion would likely die, or certainly be taken prisoner." With his head low, he crawled through the grass. He then stood, made a dash, and hid behind a tree. Bark hit him in the face as the Germans kept on shooting. He realized he just had to point his gun and shoot back. So he did, now out in the open again with scores of machine gun nests firing in his direction. He could barely see who he was firing at, but it seems like he just kept hitting his target. One by one, German men started falling. How were the Germans not hitting Alvin? It was as if bullets were going right through him. He later explained, "I knowed that in order to shoot me, the Germans would have to get their heads up to see where I was lying. And I knowed that my only chance was to keep their heads down. And I done it. I covered their positions and let fly every time I seed anything to shoot at. Every time a head came up, I done knocked it down. Then I would sort of stop for a moment, and another head would come up, and I'd knock it down too. I was giving him the best I had." God, he believed, really did have his back. He wrote in his diary, "Over 30 of them in continuous action were spitting fire and cutting up all around me, but they didn't seem to be able to hit me." He picked up another rifle and fired off as many rounds as possible before the gun heated in his hands and made it almost impossible to hold. There must have been 30 machine guns returning fire. Suddenly, 5 Germans got out of their positions and ran at him with fixed bayonets on their guns. Alvin fired off his last clip and then pulled out his pistol. He wrote, "I touched off the 6th man first, then the 5th, then the 4th, then the 3rd, and so on. And that's the way we shoot wild turkeys at home. I guess I just naturally did it. I know, too, that if the front ones wavered, or if I stopped them, the rear ones would drop down and pump a volley into me and get me." He just kept on shooting. By this time, he had no idea how many Germans he'd killed. Some of his own men lying injured nearby couldn't believe their eyes. It looked as though Alvin was bulletproof, and he seemed to kill a man every time he fired. He literally couldn't miss. He later wrote, "I know now that if I done kept my head and I didn't run out of ammunition, I had them. So I done holler to them to come down and give up. I didn't want to kill any more than I had to. I'd take a couple of them off and holler again. But I guess they couldn't understand my language, or else they couldn't hear me in the awful racket that was going on all around." Now German bodies were strewn all over the ground. The guys who just charged at him with bayonets were dead or close to it. Alvin moved forward when he saw the German commander stand up. The commander shouted, "English." Alvin shouted, "No, not English." The commander shouted, "What?" Alvin replied, "American. I'm American." The commander seemed to survey the area. Not for 1 second did Alvin let his concentration slip. The commander told him, "If you stop shooting, I'll make my men come out." He added, "Just stop shooting, we'll surrender." Alvin wasn't sure he should believe him. But when he looked around at what he'd done, somehow he'd done, he realized that as strange as it looked, he was the one in the better position. The German commander really didn't think he could win. He just witnessed something he'd never seen throughout his entire military career. One man had taken out a good chunk of his battalion. Alvin then blew his whistle, and out came the Germans, each of them throwing down their guns and sticking their hands in the air. One of them tried to trick Alvin, coming out but sneakily throwing a grenade. Alvin later wrote, "He threw a little hand grenade which burst in the air in front of me. I had to tech him off. The rest surrendered without any more trouble. There were nearly 100 of them." Soon he had all these men standing in a line. They looked like school kids being reprimanded by a feared teacher. Alvin was soon joined by some of his own men who dutifully told the Germans to follow them. But first they ordered the Germans to help them collect the injured Americans. Off they went after that. A German major refused to walk. Alvin stuck his pistol in his back, and he soon changed his mind. They walked past some more German lines. Now with the confidence of a Greek god, Alvin told
It's time to rethink brushing. New Sensodyne Nourish nourishes and strengthens with a bioactive mineral action. Contains natural
Definitely good my teeth away.
the German commanders to order the men to get out of their positions and surrender. It worked, although one of the Germans spat in Alvin's face. It was embarrassing for the Germans to be ordered around by one man. Alvin wrote in his diary, "It was a problem to get them back safely to our own lines. There were so many of them, there was danger of our own artillery mistaking us for a German counterattack and opening up on us. I sure was relieved when we run into the relief squads." When Alvin was back at camp, the prisoners were counted. There were 132 men, all captured by one solitary figure. Lieutenant Woods walked down the line of prisoners while shaking his head in disbelief. He walked right up to Alvin and said, "York, have you captured the whole German army?" The prisoners went back with Alvin to regimental headquarters at Chateau-Chandelier, and over time, under more fire from the Germans. Nonetheless, the Americans traveling with Alvin felt safe. Alvin wasn't hittable. They made sure to sit close to him as they could. When they arrived, Brigadier General Lindsay said to Alvin, "Well, York, I hear you've captured the whole German army." As you know, Alvin replied, "No, sir, I got only 132. But he wouldn't listen to anyone telling him he was a great soldier, or that he was a brave soldier, or that even Lady Luck had been on his side. It was none of those things, he explained in his next diary entry. So you can see here, in the case of mine, where God helped me out. I had been living for God and working in the church some time before I come to the army. So I'm the witness to the fact that God did help me out of that hard battle, or the bush.
Yo, Dad, can I let Poppy lick the gravy? Can I let Poppy lick the gravy? Alright.
Here we go.